This is gonna be a long one, so strap in, grab some popcorn, start taking a shit, do the dishes, clean the house, rub one out, and get all the long chores in your schedule out of the way. Why does seeing feel different than hearing? What is a feeling? How do we experience? And if consciousness is just the electrical signals in my brain, then why does hearing feel different than seeing? Well, your brain has centers that are responsible for each experience, such as the nucleus accumbens or the pleasure center. But a distinction I'd like to make is that in reality, there is no actual pleasure center in the sense of an area of the brain that actually creates pleasure. Pleasure is not an actual thing. Rather, the nucleus accumbens is a network of cells which, when activated, merely produces the output signal, which causes the rest of the brain to react in a specific way due to its specific pattern of connections. There is nothing really special or unique about the area of the brain that corresponds to pleasure. While certain areas use certain chemicals more so than others, what really results in what we experience as pleasure is the network of neurons, complex activation and inhibition of other networks. At best, you could look at pleasure as the signal that comes from the specific cluster of brain cells that we have named the nucleus accumbens. It is also true that the chemicals have a big role, but they have their impact through their effect on the specific brain cells that are receptive to them. So, for example, providing the hormone oxytocin may make someone more empathetic, but it is simply because it activates and inhibits specific areas in the brain. There is no empathy chemical. The conscious experience is not in the chemical. The experience is in the centers of the brain. Your empathy center is your empathy center, while your hate center is your hate center, simply because those centers each have their own distinct feedback loop with the rest of the brain. Every part of the brain functions and is experienced based on its relationship to other parts of your brain. It's something I like to call the theory of neural relativity. So, for example, when you look at a YouTube video, first your retina picks up the light, which is transduced into neural signals which your visual cortex knows corresponds to that specific pattern of light that hit your eye. I say knows, but all that really means is that this specific pattern of light will always cause your retina to react by sending that specific neural signal. Your visual cortex doesn't know what any of that signal really means, but it gets this signal and it sends it to the rest of the brain. One of the places it sends a signal is an area that processes meaning in the visual field. That area, which is made up of millions and millions of individual neurons, doesn't actually know the meaning, but simply it receives input from the visual cortex and alters the signal based on its physical structure and sends the altered signal to other parts of the brain. Now, alteration merely means where it sends the signal. One part of the brain it sends the signal to is involved with a memory of concepts. This area of the brain has a subsection that only ever receives information when the person might be using the internet. The area doesn't know what the internet actually is, but based on its physical relationship, by which I mean its connections or synapses with the rest of the brain, it only ever receives a signal when there is information in the visual field or information in internal memory or from some other source that corresponds to the self being on or thinking about the internet. Now again, no area of the brain knows what being on the internet looks like or feels like. They just respond to their input by processing it based on their physical structure and providing an altered output. And the altered output is basically where the signal goes next. That's the alteration. It just so happens that based on the physical synapses in the brain, whenever any part of the brain experiences input that corresponds in our world to the person being on the internet, a signal happens to be directed to the area that corresponds to the concept of the internet, simply because on a physical level, it always gets a signal when the person may be on or thinking about the internet. Now, why does it always get that signal when the person is on or thinking about the internet? Because of the physical connections between the brain cells. Well, okay. Automatic perception may be starting to make a little bit of sense. But what about thought? So let's say you're watching a YouTube video and thinking, wow, that's a shit video. Well, what happened here? First, you had all the automatic perception. From there, the signals were sent to parts of your brain that we call your personality. They have physical connections that correspond to your likes and dislikes, but in your brain they're simplified as yes or no, 1 or 0, continue signal or stop signal, action potential or no action potential, send signal to the pleasure area or send signal to the disgust area. That is done, and the signal has now either gone down a path that things you like go down, or has gone down a path that things you don't like go down. Then the signal is sent to an area that corresponds to your internal dialogue. Now remember, nothing is special about this part of the brain that makes it different than the parts you're not aware of. It simply has connections with the parts of your brain that self-analyze, which is you. You are your self-awareness, your self-analyzing and self-observing parts of the brain. You only experience the signals that reach this area, also known as the frontal lobe. But okay, the area of your internal dialogue has received input corresponding to a shitty YouTube video. And based on the physical structure of the internal dialogue area and the specific connections it has, one of the signals it sends is to our dictionary areas. The area associated with the word wow gets activated, and the area associated with the word shit gets activated. Every word in the thought has an area. In fact, every syllable in the thought has an area. And each of these areas gets activated based on the specific flow of information down the physical connections in the brain. Each area, each word area, each syllable area sends a signal back to the internal dialogue area, which puts the signals together and sends the resulting signal all over the brain to be experienced by an area that is involved in hearing, an area that is involved in value judgments, even half the areas that already received earlier versions of the signal. Some of the areas are involved in self-analysis, and when the signal is sent there, you consciously experience it. And once again, no area has some special property. The area corresponding to the word wow simply has a specific effect on the signal sent to the internal dialogue area, making the signal include a property which, when analyzed by the speech centers, for example, would result in our vocal cords making a sound that you would recognize as the word wow. While the area associated with the word shit simply has a different specific effect on the signal. Areas that correspond to conscious experience don't have any magical fairy dust. These areas simply are defined by their internal connections and their relationships to the rest of the brain. Another way of saying it would be their intra-relationships and their inter-relationships. And that is why seeing feels different than hearing. They're both totally different forms of input from the environment. One is a receptor detecting electromagnetic energy, and the other is a receptor detecting fluctuations in air pressure, but the receptors turn both inputs into the same thing, electricity, electric signals in your brain. But you experience seeing and hearing differently simply because the signal goes down a different physical path in your brain, and the experience of seeing is merely activity in the brain areas that become active when you see, while the experience of hearing is simply the pattern of activity that results when you hear. Because the receptors are different, that causes the signal to go down different paths. Because the starting point is different. Always, it depends on the input. So you can consider your consciousness as the propagation of information. You're not really the physical structure of your brain because you only really experience something when a signal is propagated down the specific physical path. But your experience is the flow of information. You are the signal. Everything you experience could be conceived as a different frequency of electric signals between connected areas. Some people can actually taste colors because for some reason their brain has overconnected the areas that send and receive information on taste and color. And all the signal is electric impulses between brain cells. Just like the video you're watching doesn't exist outside of photons on a screen, outside of electricity in your brain cells, your consciousness doesn't actually exist. Rather, your brain is a reality simulator, a consciousness simulator, simulating a whole world of what-ifs. What if I existed? What if I was angry? Well, I'd react like this. And you experience that as existing. You experience that as being angry and reacting because you are the simulation. But the anger doesn't actually exist. It's like how you perceive color when color doesn't actually exist. Nothing actually has color. Light just bounces off different things in different ways. Varying wavelengths of electromagnetic energy is all that exists. But your brain simulates that variation in wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, and the experience of that simulation is what we all call color. The signal going down different pathways as a response to different inputs, different wavelengths of light, that is what we call red. That is what we call blue. Red is simply a signal going down its path in our brain, and blue is simply a signal going down another path in our brain. Really, if we were being honest, we'd call color the direct path in our brain that the signal goes through. In reality, our brain is just a reality simulator, although it overestimates how big of a part of reality the self is. And we're so naive when we assume that a computer couldn't eventually do the same thing. Just like every experience of a computer could be described as the frequency of ones and zeros in specific hardware areas, so too all of your experiences could be explained similarly. All psychological thought is physical, just like all software programs are physical, in electric signals, in ones and zeros, in logic gates. Everything that you think is physical. But okay. Let's answer one last question. Why do I only have conscious experience of half of the signals in my brain and not the other half? And how do I have conscious control if the signal is automatic? The answer to this is that you are the signal in your frontal lobes. For you to be conscious of an experience, the signal has to reach your frontal lobes, and your frontal lobe's reaction, or the signal that it sends back to the rest of your brain, that is your conscious decision making. To illustrate this, let's run through a scenario where you are hungry and you have the choice between a hot dog and a hamburger. Does free will exist? Well, let's see. First, your body sends your brain the signal it sends whenever your energy stores are depleted. This signal gets bounced all around your brain, causing a multitude of effects, but eventually it's sent to somewhere in the frontal lobe and you experience the pain of hunger. Of course, when I say the pain of hunger, it's really just a no signal, a something is wrong signal that as a baby you associated with food because when you ate, it happened to go away. But okay, your frontal lobe has this signal and now it needs to make the decision of what to do. Now to clarify, this decision is automatic. It's simply an equation that was created when you were a baby. The input is a hunger signal, and the equation creates an output. In your case, the hundreds of thousands of neurons create the output that reflects time to eat. And right there, you've made your conscious decision. Because you are the running of that equation. It was possible for you to decide, no, it's not time to eat, but based on the algorithm in your brain, which you experienced as thought, the automatic reaction to the input was time to eat. Now, this algorithm is constantly changing, adapting to other algorithms, evolving based on previous versions of itself. And it is an equation reflected in the physical connections in the brain cells. And the connections between brain cells are always changing. Simply making a decision changes the way you will make that decision next time you're put in the same situation. But alright, now the signal is in your frontal lobe and it reflects time to eat. Options are hot dog and hamburger. And that's sent to your unconscious areas outside your frontal lobe. Some are preference systems, some memory systems are activated, risk versus reward systems are activated, value systems, and a signal eventually returns with all the relevant information about the options. You're allergic to hot dogs, but you like the taste more. And there is only one hamburger left and they're your friend's favorite. But these specific hot dogs don't look very good, and they have hair on them. And somewhere along the line, the neurons in your frontal lobe reach a consensus, a decision is made, and it is sent to the rest of the brain, which tells your muscles to pick up the food you picked. But wait, right there is where you controlled your decision. Right there is where you made the conscious decision, where you put in the effort, where you exercised self-control. What was that? What was that you deciding? Well, it was millions of neurons running a calculation, reaching a consensus. You experienced that as effort, because whenever a signal reaches consensus, it has that effect on the frontal lobe. The effect you experience as putting in effort, as putting in thought. Now, okay, let's say you decide to grab the food, you go and grab it off the barbecue, and whoops, your finger touches the burning hot grill. Now, you don't even have to think about it. The signal doesn't even get to your frontal lobe by the time you've grabbed your hand away from the grill. This is because the signal didn't go to your frontal lobe, it went to your spinal cord. Your receptors, your touch receptors, your pain receptors knew. It doesn't need to get approval from the frontal lobe. This is an example of an unconscious decision. It's fast because it only goes to your frontal lobe after the fact, once the pain is kicked in, after all the decisions have been made. And your frontal lobe is slow. Your body knows it doesn't need to wait for your frontal lobe's permission and self-reflection before reacting to this specific kind of stimuli. All it needs to do is go to the spinal cord and back out to the motor cells. So the decision-making process is not in the frontal lobe, it's in your spinal cord. That's why it's so fast. That's why you're not conscious of that decision-making. In conscious decision-making, well, half the input and effect actually occurs within the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe isn't only involved in self-analysis. Risk versus reward assessment is also a very conscious process. But you are conscious of it because you are analyzing your decision on it while you're making it. But at the end of the day, it's really all just cause and effect. Since you don't choose your frontal lobe, the decision was automatic, and your consciousness is just along for the ride. But you experienced picking the food because the experience of picking is part of the ride. But in reality, it was the physical connections between millions of neurons that resulted in that decision. You just experienced that happening because it happened in the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that is obsessed with self-analysis and self-observation. When a bacteria tries to get away from a larger bacteria that's trying to eat it, well, there the process becomes obvious. There's no brain in a bacteria, only receptors. There's no consciousness in a bacteria, only chemical reactions and physical results. This is where the chemistry of intent evolved. The bacteria doesn't really think about escaping. It doesn't really try in a psychological sense. It has no consciousness. It just has receptors with automatic reactions. Eventually that evolved into an entire organ dedicated to responding to input. And eventually that organ evolved a self-analysis mechanism called the frontal lobe, where the organ itself was the input. Suddenly, the experience of trying to escape could exist because the organ was analyzing itself. The organ observing itself having a specific type of activity and signal is where the conscious intent of trying was born. Even though ironically, it occurred well after the fact. It occurred when it observed itself making the decision. But really all it is receptors having a physical result. Now this doesn't mean you shouldn't ever make choices, because what's the point? Yes, whatever decision your brain makes in a given situation is always the decision your brain was going to make at that instance in time. But maybe if you're put in the same situation again, your brain will calculate a different outcome based on experiencing that situation before. Things can change. And the part of your brain that is responsible for that change will be your frontal lobes. So yes, based on the theory of determinism, if you reach your goals or don't reach your goals, that is what was always going to happen. And yes, you don't really get to choose. Your frontal lobe chooses, and you don't choose your frontal lobe. Really, it's just a calculation. You're just along for the ride. But if your frontal lobe decides not to try, then I can guarantee you that failure is what was going to happen. Don't you want to be the frontal lobe that puts in effort and reaches its goals? Hopefully you are. Hopefully, this input will result in your algorithm choosing to put in effort. And for a while I was stuck thinking, shit, I'm a frontal lobe that's tired all the time, and I can't accomplish my goals because a tired brain is just what I was stuck with. But then I thought, hey, maybe I'm a brain that overcomes its tiredness and still accomplishes its goals despite being so tired. And that was what the algorithm put out. So, while the future might be set in stone, and you might be automatic, you don't know what the future is, and your automatic response can automatically change due to experience and your environment. The moral of all of this is really simple for me. I don't know if I'm going to be a famous YouTube channel that changes the way people see themselves and others, but if my neurons don't decide to tap into my energy stores and activate my effort centers, I can assume that it's much less likely to happen. That's the equation that's going on in my brain. So here's to hoping I have the right brain. Or in other words, in the words of our current society, make the right decisions.